If Jonathan Hickman's X-Men series is as effective and successful as I imagine it will be, I think Powers of 10 will be looked upon very favorably in the future, but for now, it's definitely the less attractive sibling to House of X. X-Men readers across the board were blown away by last week's House of X #1, the introduction of a new dawn of Marvel Comics X-Men. This week's companion series, Powers of 10 #1, releases and promises to present the new X-Men status quo from a new angle. Hickman introduces many new mysteries in House of X while paying respect to several past X-Men creators and events. Marvel Comics promises Powers of 10 reveals the secret past, present, and future of mutantkind, changing the way you look at every X-Men story before and after. Certainly a bold claim and difficult task, given the oftentimes convoluted nature of 50 plus years of X-Men preceding it. Several things felt off about the X-Men in House of X. Charles Xavier has taken an isolationist stance with humans, offering 3 revolutionary medicines in exchange for mutant sovereignty on the island of Krakow. Humans aren't allowed on this sentient island without mutant permission. This doesn't exactly sync up with Professor X's historical views on human-mutant relations. His plan sounds much more sinister and feels more like a stance Magneto would take. Magneto is mutant ambassador for Krakow. Mutants are developing their own unique language and cultures away from human interference. Several character motivations and actions feel a bit off in House of X. There's definitely more than meets the eye, and I firmly believe several, if not all, the X-Men introduced in House of X are imposters of some sorts. There's also the lettering that's consistent with Marvel's Ultimate Universe. Why is it used? Jonathan Hickman is a detail-oriented storyteller. There's no way that was introduced by accident. He also cited Bendis' previous work at Marvel as an inspiration of sorts for his X-Men story. Powers of 10 #1 is the first of a 6-issue companion miniseries to House of X, leading into Dawn of X. Powers of 10 is written by Jonathan Hickman and illustrated by R.B. Silva. Will Powers of 10 continue the momentum of the extremely well-received smash hit House of X? Does Hickman's leadership of the X-Men franchise indicate greater days ahead? There's only one way to find out. First things first, I recommend Powers of 10 #1, but not nearly as enthusiastic as House of X. Now let's start with R.B. Silva's art. The artwork, especially at the beginning and end of the issue, takes a noticeable step back from House of X's Pepe Larraz. The opening scene between Charles Xavier and an old acquaintance feels separate from the rest of the book. At one point, Professor X doesn't appear to have eyeballs, and some of the facial expressions are manga or anime inspired. The rest of the issue doesn't feature these at all. It gives a bit of a disjointed feel overall. However, the color work from Marte Garcia continues to impress and adds a level of cohesiveness between Powers of 10 and House of X. The art gets noticeably better in the second and third time frames before falling off a bit towards the final pages. R.B. Silva lays out the panels very well, and the scenes are easy to follow visually. Silva does nail the action for the most part, and that's a good thing. Powers of 10 has a lot more of it than its counterpart. This scene in particular during the X2 timeline is particularly great and oozes dynamism and a genuine cool factor. Overall, R.B. Silva's art in Powers of 10 #1 is good, but a bit inconsistent for my taste. I rate it 3.5 out of 5. Before I get into my analysis of Jonathan Hickman's characterization and plotting in the issue, I need to address the story aids. I praise the excellent reference material in House of X for helping fill in backstory and moving the plot along. I think Hickman might have been a bit too ambitious with Powers of 10. There is a ton of information in these pages of text, and it's very dense and boring. I can't think of many things to stop me from enjoying a book faster than in-depth info on mutant breeding programs on Mars. I'm sorry. This is likely very exciting for a lot of hardcore Hickman and X-Men fans, but I think there's a good chance many new or casual readers checked out in the middle of these pages. I gave the creative team an A+ for the plot aids in House of X, but the materials in Powers of 10 are C- or D+ in my opinion. This information is likely to read like gold in the future, but in the here and now, it was hard work getting through it. I'm going to be honest, this is probably the hardest review I've ever had to do. There's some really good stuff in this book. Heck, even a few great answers to mysteries introduced in House of X. But there's a lot of head-scratching moments as well. I get this is set up for future issues, but I have to rate the book as it is, not what it's likely to represent 2.5 months from now. So here goes. The book begins with Charles sitting on a park bench at a fair. He's approached by a woman who wants to know why he's so happy. He's happy because he's had a wonderful dream of a better world and his place in it. Presumably the creation of his team of mutant superheroes and the founding of his school for gifted children. A far cry from the Professor X in House of X. Eventually the story arrives in the X2 time frame, 100 years after the formation of the X-Men. A large portion of the characterization and plotting is provided here. We meet 3 versions of mutants bred for war in the future. Rasputin is a 3rd generation Chimera warrior with DNA from 5X genes. Cardinal is an outlier class of passive mutants obsessed with creation mythology and also referred to as a priest. Not surprisingly, these anomalies look like descendants of Nightcrawler. Probably a poor choice for DNA splicing for a warrior class of mutants. And finally, one of the last generation of hounds with black brains who have traitor instincts bred into them by the man-machine supremacy. Hickman probably could have made a cooler name for the villains. And if I'm being totally honest, I don't think Hickman provided a believable reason for purposely creating a warrior class with predispositions to defecting. We also meet a few key leaders in the man-mutant supremacy. I believe the lady in res is supposed to represent the human contingent, although she appears to be more machine than man these days. Nimrod symbolizes the machine side of the supremacy. Most of R.B. Silva's new character designs are really good, but Nimrod looks a bit too much like a Power Rangers villain in my mind. All in all, Hickman does a good job of giving each class of mutant breed distinct traits. He also makes each time period very divergent. But I personally had a hard time following some of the logic involved. Intentionally creating warriors with traitor instincts sounds pretty stupid even if he explains it in the future. I rate the characterization of Powers of 10 3.5 out of 5. Let's finish with the plot without giving too much away, because it's definitely worth reading and has some very interesting reveals. The story is broken into 4 eras. X0, the dream, takes place when Charles creates the X-Men. X1, the world, takes place 10 years later during the events of House of X. X2, the war, occurs 100 years after the formation of the X-Men. Finally, X3, Ascension, is 1,000 years in the future. During Charles's conversation with Moira McTaggart, who he doesn't recognize, she talks about a fortune teller. The images on the cards are all present in the X2 timeline. The magician is Chimera warrior Rasputin. The tower is revealed to be the Tower of Nimrod the Lesser, home of the human-machine monolith. This is also the setting of the events in the X3 timeline. It's called the Pillar of Collapse in Rebirth, the Monolith of Ascension. Not coincidentally, the X3 timeline is called Ascension. I'm not going to get into my personal theories here, but the tower and its description play a huge part in them. Time travel. Time travel. Finally, the devil represents the cardinal anomalies. It appears that future events in the X2 and X3 timeline are preordained all the way back during the creation of the X-Men. The X1 story takes place in the House of M, directly following Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth breaking into damage control, stealing crucial information pertaining to Reed Richards and Tony Stark. Professor X and Magneto are very pleased they've acquired the data. I'm very curious to know what information the mutant nation of Krakow thought so important they risk an international incident while trying to gain sovereignty. It must be very essential. During the X3 timeline, the man-machine supremacy, led by a sentinel, are hunting down mutants. The mutant trio accessed the Nexus and also stole ambiguous, critical information. Rasputin tries to save her black-brained sister while the Cardinal opens a portal to Krakow. Rasputin appears equal to the Sentinel's power, but her sister is taken during the confrontation. At the Tower of Nimrod, the Lesser, it's decided they can't break their prisoner with normal interrogation methods. The man-machine supremacy! Place her in a bath to break her down to nothing but data over time. The information will be curated by an AI of Nimrod's making. This is easily the coolest concept in the book for my money. Finally, we visit the X3 timeline, 1,000 years in the future, in the Tower of Nimrod, now known as the Archive of Nimrod the Greater. a new being sits in an enormous library of information with a tiny curator robot while the black-brained trader continues disintegrating into data. There are a ton of interesting ideas Hickman's implementing in the story to varying degrees of success, but for the most part, I think he does a great job. I rate the plot of Powers of 10 number 1, 4 out of 5. I'll give Jonathan Hickman and his team this. Powers of 10 is one of the most ambitious comics I've read in some time. There are elements of the book I honestly don't like, but there is far more good than bad here. The art is better than average, but not at the quality of House of X. Powers of 10 contains a ton of characterization. Some of it falls flat, especially the mutant breeding program reference material, but a vast majority, like the plot itself, is really good. I rate Powers of 10 number 1, 3.5 out of 5 overall. I recommend this book to all X-Men readers. I imagine hardcore fans are going to come away loving this story or absolutely hating it, but they should definitely give it a chance and see if it's for them. I do believe a majority of hardcores will like this, or enough of it to stick around. I praised House of X as a great starting point for new readers. I don't feel the same way about Powers of 10. I honestly believe a decent portion of newbies will check out after this issue, and that's too bad. Hickman is doing a lot right here. If Jonathan Hickman's X-Men series is as effective and successful as I imagine it will be, I think Powers of 10 will be looked upon very favorably in the future, but for now, it's definitely the less attractive sibling to House of X. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.